Welcome to Mideast Realities. I'm your host, Mark Brzezinski. This week and next, we have rather unusual MER programs. Usually, we invite the most honest and independent experts we can find to discuss the realities of the Middle East situation. We do so because the establishment media, both print and TV, far too often obscure and misrepresent the actual realities of the situation. There are many interest groups and think tanks whose job it is to influence the media away from realities and towards the viewpoints of various governments and what can be termed the post-Cold War military-industrial complex. The Israeli-Jewish lobby's influence in Washington is very well known, of course, and it has never been greater than with the Clinton administration. Consequently, with MER, we try to discuss the actual realities of the Middle East as opposed to what the lobbyists, the government spokesmen, and the arms merchants want you to think is happening. This evening, however, we're at the Adass Israel Synagogue in Washington, D.C., to hear what Moshe Arens has to say. Moshe Arens, one of Israel's leading politicians from the Likud party, has served as Israel's ambassador to the U.S., as well as both Israeli defense and foreign ministers. One of the myths about Israel is that the two major Israeli parties have very different basic policies. Now, while the two parties do have different styles and origins, and while they do use very different rhetoric, and while they do approach some important issues in different ways, the overall Zionist approach of both Labor and Likud to the Palestinians and to the Middle East in general has far more similarities than differences. It was the Israeli Labor Party, for instance, that began the settlement policies in the occupied territories. Likud then expanded them. It is the Israeli Labor Party which today champions a policy it calls separation between Israelis and Palestinians, an apartheid-type policy also dear to Likud. And it is none other than the Labor Party Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, who a few years ago served during the last Likud government as the break-their-bones defense minister, while today's foreign minister, Shimon Peres, also worked closely with Likud in the past. Indeed, it appears that Likud governance of Israel may be approaching again. By early 1996, if not sooner, Israel will be in the throes of a historic election campaign, and indications are that Likud's Benjamin Netanyahu may well become prime minister. So today's talk by Moshe Arens before an almost exclusively Jewish audience will no doubt bring insights into what twists and turns to expect if and when the Likud strikes again. Overall, shifting Likud labor governments can be thought of as a kind of good cop, bad cop routine. Indeed, one of Likud's more significant accomplishments is to help portray labor as somehow more reasonable and more moderate, even if basic labor policies usually mirror those of the Likud in actual practice. Remembering these important caveats, still it will be extremely interesting to hear how Moshe Arens presents himself tonight. Listen hard and listen skeptically, for most of the significant things Arens will say will be vague and between the lines. Even the Likud has learned to portray itself when abroad and when speaking in English very cautiously, so as not to offend more liberal American Jewish audiences. More liberal than themselves, that is. Indeed, Moshe Arens will surely be trying very hard tonight to mask the realities of today's Middle East. So I'll occasionally try to interject a few correctives of my own as we go.
Pleasure to welcome Ambassador Arens, who was at one time not only a member of the community, but was considered a member of this congregation. To welcome him home to Adass Israel, to welcome our panelists, and to thank you for being here. I want to call on Sarah Lazarus, representing the American Jewish Committee, and thank Jeff Weintraub and the committee for all their efforts in making this evening possible.
If you haven't noticed already, there are copies of Mr. Arens' new book available for sale, and the ambassador has agreed to stay on for at least a short while and sign some books if you'd like to take advantage of that opportunity. Let me just briefly introduce this extremely distinguished panel, and I'll say a few things about them later when their turn to fire questions if the ambassador comes. We have Josh Goshko of the Washington Post, Barry Schwei of the AP, and Margaret Warner, who is now with the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour, all of them extremely experienced and respected journalistic experts on the Middle East. Mr. Arens comes to us tonight at a moment when Israel is facing one of its greatest challenges. On the one hand, Israel has never been at peace with as many neighbors as it is today. On the other hand, it is not at peace, as the spate of suicide bombings and other clashes with violent rejectionists have demonstrated. Mr. Arens is going to both talk about the matters that are covered in his new book concerning his own tenure as a member of the Likud cabinet in the most recent government. I'm sure he'll also be willing to talk about the events that we're all concerned about today. Just in case some of you don't know, Ambassador Arens has been a leading member of the Likud party since his election to the Knesset in 1974, beginning with his appointment in 1982 as ambassador to the U.S. He has since taken on a variety of important positions, including defense minister and foreign minister in the mid-80s and early 90s. He was born in Lithuania. He grew up in Latvia. He immigrated to the U.S. at the outbreak of World War II, and then to Israel in 1948. He has degrees in engineering from MIT and Caltech. He's been a university lecturer on engineering in Israel. He ran his own engineering firm. He oversaw Israel's major aircraft and weapons systems programs in his role as Vice President for Engineering with Israel Aircraft Industries. 2 years ago, Mr. Arens resigned from the Knesset, and since then he has served as Vice Chairman of the Israel Corporation. He's also the author of the just-released book, which is what we're here for, Broken Covenant, American Foreign Policy and the Crisis Between the U.S. and Israel. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Arens.
Thank you very much. It is really a pleasure to be with you here tonight. It's almost like homecoming, coming back to Washington after many, many years. I spent a year in the city as Israel's ambassador. I'm always surprised on meeting people who seem to think that I must have been here for 4 or 5, 6 or 7 years. It was only 12 months, but they were a very intense 12 months. It was the period of the war in Lebanon, and those of you whose memory goes back that far will probably recall that during that period I appeared on television here almost every day, and sometimes twice or 3 times a day. And there's a certain element of nostalgia connected with coming back to the city, in which I spent a memorable year. As you've heard in the introduction, I've done many things in my life. I'm probably on my 7th career at this stage, but I had never written a book. This is the first book I've written. I think it's probably the last book I'm going to write. Because I'm busy doing things, I had never thought that I would end up writing a book, but I wanted to get it out of my system. I thought it was important to tell the story of 4 years, 1988 to 1992, 4 years in which I was Israel's foreign minister and Israel's defense minister. Years that were very eventful, that are important even now when we look back at these years, and there have been many events since then. The title of the book, as I originally envisaged it, was going to be War and Peace in the Middle East, 1988 to 1992. That is the title of the book in Hebrew, Milchama v'Shalom b'Mizrach Tichon, 1988 to 1992. But the American publisher wanted a somewhat zappier title, I guess, and that's how this Broken Covenant title got born. The book, as you can judge, is not an autobiography. I thought that it would divert attention from the story that I felt needed to be told, and probably would not be told by anybody else, and maybe it would have gone untold unless I wrote this book, if I were to stretch it all the way from the time and place where I was born until the present time. So maybe I'll just say a few words about my biography, the pieces and parts that do not appear with any prominence in the book. I went to Israel in 1948 from the United States. Quite frequently, people in the United States will ask me, how is it that you went to Israel in 1948? And I'm a little hesitant to respond with what naturally comes to my mind. I would say, how is it that you did go to Israel in 1948? Because to me, at that time, it seemed like the only thing to do. An obligation that I, as a young Jew at the time, felt I had. I had the feeling at the time, and I think correctly so, in a historical perspective, that the Jewish people, 3 years after the full dimensions of the Holocaust had become apparent, were fighting for their lives. That maybe this was really our last battle for survival. And I thought every Jew that could contribute in any manner or measure to victory in that battle had to do his part. I afterwards returned to my profession. I was an aeronautical engineer. I taught at the Technion in the Department of Aeronautical Engineering that was founded at the time under the inspiration of David Ben-Gurion, who was Prime Minister and Defense Minister at the time. I never dreamt in my wildest dreams that I would ever end up being Israel's Defense Minister and hold the office that he held. It was a great period for me, teaching at the Technion, then going on to become the Chief Engineer of Israel Aircraft Industries, which was no more than a garage when I first started there in 1982 that did minor modifications of aircraft. And that within a number of years became one of the great aerospace industries of the world, created, developed by these young graduates of the Department of Aeronautical Engineering of the Technion. And it was only after I left Israel Aircraft Industries in 1971 that I went into business, had a little more time, a little more money, and in a moment of weakness allowed myself to be talked into going into politics and running for the Knesset, thinking that maybe I would contribute 4 years or part of my time during 4 years on the political scene, do what I could for my country as a politician. But the 4 years stretched out to be 18 years, and the last 4 years of those 18 years are recorded in the book that you have before you. There were, I think, important years in Israel's history, and they included 4 specific developments, events, if you like. One, the Intifada. I inherited the Intifada from my predecessor at the Ministry of Defense, Yitzhak Rabin. We changed posts twice, a very unusual occurrence anywhere and unprecedented in Israel. He took over the Defense Ministry from me in 1984 after my first tenure as Defense Minister, and then again in 1992 after Labour won the elections, and I turned the Defense Minister over to him. Intifada broke out during the time that he was Defense Minister. When I became Foreign Minister after the Likud election victory in 1988, it was going strong. It was causing Israel a great deal of damage. Rabin used to say, and I agreed and repeated that it was not endangering the very existence of the State of Israel. It wasn't like the Yom Kippur War. But we knew that it had the seeds of causing Israel a great deal of damage, which in the long run might create dangers that maybe we couldn't even fully conceive. But when I entered the Foreign Ministry, I realized that Israel was becoming increasingly isolated, coming under attack and pressure not only from those who had never been friends of Israel, but also from friends of Israel, from members of the Jewish community. There was considerable concern and dissension in Israel itself, and it was a phenomenon that had to be addressed. I point out in the book that I think it was a very grave mistake on the part of Israeli governments, mostly Labour, but eventually also Likud, that over the years since 1967, when Judea, Samaria and Gaza came under Israeli control, the Palestinian population was in effect ignored. There was no Israeli policy towards the Palestinian problem. It was a non-policy. It was a non-policy that was originally enunciated by Moshe, who was defense minister during the Six-Day War and for many years thereafter, which in effect said that Israel was waiting for a telephone call from King Hussein. There was some specious logic in the saying. Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, had been annexed by Jordan in 1948 after Jordan participated in the attack on Israel in 1948. The Palestinian population, in those days it was called the Arab population of the area, had received Jordanian citizenship, and so Dayan said, and that policy was then followed by successive Israeli governments. When and if King Hussein came to the peace table, that would be the time to address and negotiate the status of the territories and of the people living in the territories. But the gap between King Hussein and Jordan and the Palestinian population became increasingly wide over the years, and the feeling of frustration that their problems, their aspirations were not being addressed, the very difficult economic situation that prevailed in these areas, especially in Gaza, certainly in retrospect we can say inevitably brought about the massive civil disturbances that characterized the Intifada. I had to deal with that directly when I became defense minister after the National Unity government broke up in 1990, when I took over from Yitzhak Rabin. And I'm a little hesitant in giving myself compliments, but in effect the Intifada was almost finished by the time of the elections of 1992. There were no more massive disturbances. There was hardly any more publicity given to the Intifada. You didn't see it on the television screens anymore. It had run out of steam, mainly because it had been a period of great suffering and great difficulty for the Palestinian population, but also because we had, I think, sent a clear message to them that Israel was not going to give in to violence and that nothing was going to be achieved by rock throwing. And by the time I left the Defense Ministry in 1992, we had essentially restored normal life to the territories. I had opened all of the schools, all of the universities. The PLO, in effect, was in many ways finished, run out of steam, and that I suppose is the explanation, and that is the explanation given by many for the reason that Arafat was ready to make the agreement with Yitzhak Rabin when the Rabin government indicated its readiness to make an agreement with the PLO. They didn't seem to have any alternative anymore. New life was being breathed into them at a moment when they were essentially finished. As foreign minister, I authored the Israeli Peace Initiative of May 1989. In May 1989, it was adopted by the National Unity government, in which Peres and Rabin were members. And I did my level best to get this initiative formulated and adopted by the Israeli government, because I was convinced, as I came to the foreign ministry, that it was essential for Israel to take an initiative and to show that we were not just stonewalling and not just resigning ourselves to the status quo, but that we were interested in moving the diplomatic process along, in proving to the world that if no progress was made, if no progress were to be made, it would not be because of lack of trying on our part. The peace initiative included 4 points specifically. you'll find in the book that I originally suggested 5 points, but Rabin vetoed one of them. He was defense minister at the time. And 4 points were, one, a reconfirmation of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, consultations between Israel and Egypt and the United States, which was a signatory to the Camp David Accords. 2, direct negotiations between Israel and those Arab countries that insisted that they were in a state of war with Israel. 3, negotiations between Israel and democratically elected representatives of the Palestinian population in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. And 4, an international effort to relieve the plight of the Palestinian refugees in the refugee camps. Some of those points are in the process of implementation. The initiative led eventually, after the Gulf War, to the Madrid Conference. The Madrid Conference led to direct negotiations between Israel and Palestinians, Israel and Jordanians, Israel and Syrians, Israel and Lebanese. Not all these negotiations have produced concrete results, at least not so far. Elections amongst the Palestinian population were never held. I think that that was a very bad mistake, and the negotiations that eventually brought about an agreement, which in my view is a sad mistake, were held with Yasser Arafat and the PLO, and not with the people that were elected by, or had a mandate from the population living in the area. The third major event during the 4-year period was the Gulf War. A 6-week war for Israel, a very unusual and in some ways traumatic war for Israel. Again, Israel's existence was never really in danger, although we were not quite sure of that at certain periods. We knew that Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons. We knew that he had missiles that hit Israel, and Iraqi missiles did hit Israel. 39 of them landed in Israel. We had to do something that had not been done anywhere in the world since World War II. I, as defense minister, issue gas masks to every man, woman, child, and baby in Israel in anticipation that we might be hit by Scud missiles with chemical warheads. And we found that even though it was no accident that Saddam Hussein, who was a sworn enemy of Israel and threatened Israel with destruction and threatened Israel with the use of chemical warfare, but for a certain period of time, in my view an aberration, was supported by the administration in Washington, was given amongst other things what the administration refused to give to Shamir's government, namely loan guarantees, which were not used for their presumed purpose of buying agricultural produce, but rather were used for weaponry. It was no accident that this man, who was an enemy of Israel, also turned out to be an enemy of the United States. I think that that was inevitable. But as it turned out, and I wrote about it in the book, the enemy of our enemy did not turn out to be our friend. And the Israeli-U.S. relationship during that period as well, or maybe especially during that period, was not really the kind of relationship that you would expect to have occur between two allies at war against a common enemy. The 4-year period, in terms of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, which is really one very unique, between two countries very far apart, in many ways very different. Israel, one of the smallest countries in the world, the United States, the superpower today, the leader of the democratic community of nations.